All right, good morning and welcome to our hot topic. It's hot here in August, so we thought let's do a hot topic. We'll pick something to dive into, and this has really come up a lot in our orbit here at the Community Foundation, working with some private foundations that we're actually interested in converting into funds here at the foundation. And so with all these conversations that have been going on, I thought, let's do a deeper dive and bring in some experts that we have worked with who we really love. Laura and Kelly, I'll be introducing you to them in just a bit. But we'll be looking at all the good things to help you as you work with clients who could be considering donor advised funds or private foundations. What are the differences? What are kind of the key signature features? And what would be best? I'm Andrea Scott. I'm the Chief Philanthropy Officer here at the Community Foundation. I've been here for about 3 years now. I'm just really expanding on all of our services and options for philanthropy here in the North State. I have worked in philanthropy for 25 years now. So, and speaking of 25 years, the Community Foundation is now entering our 25th year here at the foundation. It's our 25th anniversary. Trying to get my slide to advance, and it's being persnickety. Let's see if I can get this. There we go. So in 25 years, some big accomplishments have occurred. We have granted more than $65 million since our founding. And when you think about where we started with $300,000 in assets and only 7 funds. So we were a tiny little thing. And to see that we've grown this much in 25 years to have made an impact of $65 million is something we're really proud of. We serve Shasta, Siskiyou, and Tehama counties. Every year, we also manage and distribute scholarship funds to the tune of about $350,000. Many nonprofits and donors know us for North State Giving Tuesday. This last year was a record year for us, which is a record year after a record year, right? So we had 2 record years in a row, and it's really exciting to see that continue to grow and grow each year. And we hit $1.6 million, which when you think about it, our giving day is a 14-hour day. So for the North State and the generosity of our donors to come up with $1.6 million in 14 hours is mind-blowing. So we're so proud of the nonprofits for all their work with donors and their great impact in the North State. And to see this continue to grow and support their work is incredible. So also on that note, North State Giving Tuesday will be December 2nd this year. So mark your calendars. We have over 180 funds here at the North State focused on all sorts of different priorities and programs throughout our communities, holding over $39 million now in charitable assets for grant making. Okay. We have, excuse me. Okay, I really will get this right eventually. I'm going to go over our agenda really quickly. We're going to talk about structure, grant making, asset management, contributions, and when to use which. So we're going to compare structures of each type of vehicle, donor advised funds and private foundations. But our main point is really not making an argument for one or the other. It's really helping you understand when and why and how these would work best for your clients. And to help us dive into all this are our experts, Laura McKnight and Kelly Cavey. They join us with a really unique perspective, as they are, of course, attorneys who have worked with clients, who've established donor advised funds, who've established private foundations, but they've also worked at community foundations. And now they work at Embolden, which is really a partnering agency for both community foundations and advisors in assisting their clients. So we are so fortunate to have them here and their incredible experience and perspective to add to this conversation. So welcome, Laura and Kelly. We're so pleased to have you here.
Thank you.
Before we dive in, to the details of our agenda. I just wanted to get your thoughts on sort of the high level view. What are some of the trends you're seeing with donor advised funds and with private foundations? What is it looking like out there?
Well, it's such a good question because there's so much, as you all know, that's rapidly evolving in philanthropy, in not small part to the new tax laws. So what's interesting to look at right now is what the One Big Beautiful Bill Act is going to do for charitable giving techniques this year and next year. And so you throw that into the mix with the really great question that Andrea has raised around the role of private foundations and the role of donor advised funds. And it just makes it a fun time to look into how to structure vehicles. I think another trend we're seeing, we work with 270 or so community foundations across the country. And we really, Andrea, I don't want to embarrass you, but with what North State does is really incredible. The knowledge that Andrea has and what North State Community Foundation does for advisors and for donors is pretty exceptional. So even just to be having this kind of conversation is wonderful. And that is a really important trend that people are beginning to ask more sophisticated questions around philanthropy. Maybe you've seen that with your clients more recently as some of this information has become more mainstream in the financial media. So we're glad to be here, and I know you all are too.
Yeah, I think I would add just a couple of other, echo everything Laura said and echo everything wonderful about Andrea, and thank you for having us here today. I would add a couple other trends that we continue to see is donor advised fund, so private foundation to donor advised fund conversions. And some of that is due to this generational transfer of wealth that is happening. So sometimes what worked for mom and dad isn't working quite as well for kids. And so seeing private foundations convert to donor advised funds or living side by side as complementary tools, which I know we'll dive into. And then I think changes in federal funding have made it such that these tools are truly more important than ever. And donor advised funds and private foundations allow donors to give gifts that they may not otherwise be able to make to nonprofits directly. So gifts of complex assets to control the timing of those gifts. So they're really incredible tools. And how and why they're used depends on the situation, but it's great to have such wonderful tools in our industry to help our clients.
Thank you both. Let's look at structure. And of course, we're not going to go, read this out loud to you. You all can check out the slides and look at the details. But I wanted to highlight a few things because I would say, structurally, that's the biggest difference. They are completely different types of charitable vehicles from their structure. So let's highlight a few of those pieces. So what, from your perspective, Laura, Kelly, whoever wants to take the question, structurally, what really motivates a donor to consider a private foundation instead of a donor advised fund?
Well, and a kind of a threshold consideration sometimes is just who do you want watching over you? We know that any kind of tax structure is going to be watched by the IRS somewhere along the way. And so what we used to share with our clients at the Community Foundation here in Kansas City, and I know, Andrea, you at the Community Foundation of the North State are saying, if you set up a private foundation, the IRS is watching you. If you set something up with Community Foundation of the North State, we'll handle the IRS and we work with you. And it's really interesting that fundamental reality of that part of the structure is just who's watching this and who's responsible for this is a theme that I was really part of every conversation at some point. And then of course there are these things that are really detailed on the structure. But I think it's important to mention that because that sentiment is pretty widespread.
I think the thing that I hear most often is if a donor or client wants full control, private foundation's a no-brainer. You don't have full control of a donor advised fund. It is not your own separate legal entity that you're managing as a, a board member, as a trustee. But private foundations give you that option. So control tends to be the sort of the carrot involved in the decision-making process. But certainly there are downsides to that type of structure, like you're mentioning, Laura, then, yes, you have control, but you still have that level of oversight with the IRS as well. Kelly?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say the other thing that I think has always come up when I've navigated these conversations over the years, and the way I would describe it is a private foundation is truly running your own business. A nonprofit is a business. It's just a different type of business. So it truly is setting up a legal entity, filing your own tax returns, to Laura's point, having the oversight and the control, but the control comes with all the responsibility.
Yeah.
The other thing, it's a little bit of a misnomer in the name because a private foundation is truly anything but private. Everything is discoverable. So all of the grant making history for the most part is online, whereas with the donor advised fund, it can provide a level of anonymity. So the donor can choose to make some donations using the name of the donor advised fund, which, by the way, they can call a foundation. Or they can have it be anonymous, which I think is really appealing to some people to have that ability. And I think just the cost and complexity, there's a very different feel with a donor advised fund where you're really benefiting from the back office support of the sponsoring organization, the community foundation.
I love that you pointed out the sort of the misnomer of private foundation. That is interesting, that the name, certainly it is anything but private. It is in every way, it's fully discoverable. Absolutely. We'll dive into a little bit more of these points. And just so all of you that have joined us today, we're so glad you're here. If you have questions along the way, feel free to pop them into the chat as well. We will be sharing the recording, the slides, and all the details with you, so you can go back through as well. All right, grant making. So the grant making is really where I see community foundations, donor advised funds, and private foundations can actually be a great partnership when it comes to grant making. We have several that we work with that are private foundations, but we do an element of their grant making, whether it's like the McConnell Foundation here locally. They have a fund with us that is a competitive grant making cycle that we offer, and we run the whole program. And that is a common option among many community foundations, that they will partner with private foundations and offer all the grant making services from start to finish. So it really does add an extra level of sophistication and expertise to the private foundations grant making processes. Any thoughts, Laura and Kelly, on that partnership?
I'm glad you put it that way. That's really well said, Andrea, because a lot of times a combined solution is what is best for the client, to have both a private foundation and a donor advised fund for lots of different reasons. But that's one of them, is so that they can have a private foundation, have a donor advised fund, work closely with the community foundation and tap into that expertise, and then also take advantage of some of the characteristics of each that they find appealing.
Yeah. One of the things that is really important and unique to private foundations is the 5% rule, of course. Donor advised funds, currently, there are no rules for how much donor advised funds are required to pay out each year. TBD with legislation coming on that. There's always been chatter, but nothing is in place from a legislative perspective on payouts for donor advised funds, although they are historically quite high. I believe the last stat I read is donor advised funds from national scale are paying out around 23 to 25% a year. So they're much higher than private foundations and their overall charitable impact. Private foundations do have that minimum threshold of 5%. Can you talk a little bit more about what the rules are? What applies to that 5%?
Sure. Do you want me to jump in? So, knowing we have, I think, some true accountants on the call who could probably talk about this in great detail, I will say at a high level, it's murky. There's been a lot of uh, cases on this and challenges to this over the years, which speaks to the complexity of the private foundation model and how the IRS typically looks at private foundations with just a little more scrutiny because of the amount of control the donor has over the entity. But generally speaking, the 5% what counts are true grants. And then some of the operational costs associated with managing the private foundation, and the amount of which and the percentage of the which depends on how those are kind of categorized.
Yeah. One of the things that is also important to note, obviously all of these funds are invested, right? Private foundations are fully invested, and assumably that's going to only continue to grow. And it's always important to remember that in years where the markets are down, and they might not have any returns, they still have to make that 5% payout. It doesn't adjust with the market results, so that payout is required no matter what. Some of the unique things that are available, though, to private foundations in terms of grant making that are not available to donor advised funds. And there's some really unique things that for more sophisticated donors who want to have a level of grant making that is not as traditional would find this really appealing. So donor advised funds cannot make grants to individuals, right? So that is out of the question. That's not an option. But it is an option for private foundations. There are also some other options for, foreign nonprofits, non-charitable organizations, as long as there's a charitable purpose behind it. There's also some really interesting program-related investment options. So private foundations can provide what they call a PRI loans, loan guarantees, equity investments. PRIs can earn returns for the private foundation. So that's kind of an interesting option that's, not available for donor advised funds. Any kind of highlights you want to make about some of those unique things that private foundations can take advantage of? And do you think that that is something that many are tapping into, or is it really just a niche sort of client who would want that level of grant making?
A great question. And I think you've brought up something so important, Andrea, because donor advised funds as vehicles, especially through commercial providers, the Fidelities and others, are, can be limited. What's really nice about having a donor advised fund with Community Foundation of the North State or a community foundation is that the community foundation has other tools at its disposal. So even things that really cannot, like you said, be done in the confines of a donor advised fund per se, the community foundation as a whole can really help with those things. And then you're right, Andrea, you just have to say, okay, when we're just comparing these two vehicles, if there are layers of complexity that a family or a client wants with private foundations, that certainly can tip the scales.
I do want to make a quick note, by the way, about commercial donor advised funds, because I don't want to exclude them from the conversation. Obviously, I'm sitting from the seat of a community foundation. Donor advised funds held at what we consider commercial, so Fidelity Charitable, Schwab Charitable, Vanguard, those folks. They offer some great tools for grant making in terms of if a donor knows who they want to support, when, how, et cetera. There's great online tools that they can, sort of one-click options to get grants out. However, they don't often provide any form of additional services for grant making. So if a donor's interested in additional research in a field or some, just real local expertise to a certain area that a donor is interested in making grants to. There are limitations from the commercial end of the donor advised fund spectrum. So, I just want to put that part out of there. We're certainly not against donor advised funds from a commercial entity. We actually work with donors who have commercial funds as well as community foundation funds. And they like the options of both, right? 'Cause each one has unique services that are available to them. I wanted to also dive into a little bit more, unless there's other comments you wanted to make around grant making. The asset management part of this. There's certainly a private foundation, right, manages their own assets, right? Their board are making decisions about that. What are the pros and cons that you see for private foundation asset management versus donor advised fund asset management? What are the options there and the choices that tend to be the appeal to each?
Laura, do you want
Yeah,
me
you go
to jump
ahead.
in?
Yeah, you're good.
So I think so oversight. So again, I think it comes back to how much control and oversight one wants to have. So with a private foundation, typically there are some broader parameters in how the assets can be managed. And with that comes the responsibility of ensuring that they're properly managed. So it's really important that the structure is put into place and that the board members are competent and capable to support the foundation in managing that themselves. With the community foundation, typically donors who establish a donor advised fund have an option to choose from one or more investment programs that are overseen by the community foundation, its committees and board. And the donor recommends the program of investment. So just like they recommend grants from the donor advised fund to nonprofits of their choice. So to Andrea's earlier point, they don't have true control. And yet community foundations have been doing this for a very long time. And unless there's a compelling reason not to, they are taking the donor's suggested recommendations within those prescribed pool of investments. The other thing I would say is that some community foundations have allowed donors to use their own financial advisor to continue being a partner with the community foundation to manage the assets in their specific donor advised fund. And so that can be a really wonderful partnership for the donor and the community foundation and the financial advisor to really be working together to support the donor's philanthropic goals and aligning the investable assets maybe with the donor's overall investable goals.
Yeah, that's a great point. We offer that here at the Community Foundation. It's called our Donor Recommended Investment Management Program. So if a donor has an advisor they really want to continue working with, then we work with that advisor to set up the assets with them for that investment. One of the things I do want to point out about private foundations, if clients have property, art, just unique illiquid assets that they do not want to liquidate, a private foundation can actually hold those assets. A donor advised fund is going to liquidate them. We don't hold illiquid assets, for the long term. We certainly work with donors who have those assets and want to liquidate them into a fund of some sort. But private foundations do have the advantage of being able to hold on to things like art collections or property. So if you're working with clients like that who have illiquid assets they want to keep, then that's a great option with a private foundation as well. Any comments around asset management to kind of wrap up this slide?
That's great.
Contributions. Okay, so we tapped a little bit of this in talking about the type of assets that can be accepted. But there are some really key differences around the contribution that a donor advised fund can accept and a private foundation can accept, and the tax advantages for those contributions. So are there some considerations or restrictions that you would, point out to clients if they're considering either of these?
Yeah, in general, the deductibility of contributions to these vehicles is going to be more favorable on the donor advised fund side. And the reason for that is because donor advised funds are considered what the IRS calls a public charity, and a private foundation is not that, it's a private foundation. So the IRS has always treated contributions to public charities much more favorably. So you've done a nice job, Andrea, in outlining some of those things. One of the sad cautionary tales that we would see sometimes is someone who had closely held stock, and they knew, in a couple of years they were going to sell, and they were trying to do some good planning, and they popped some of that stock into a private foundation. Yeah, and then they sold, and then they would call and say, hey, we heard that if we do this through the community foundation, through a donor advised fund, we could, not have bad tax consequences, but, too late. So thinking ahead, so any clients that have closely held companies or even real estate, popping that into a donor advised fund, as you can see on the slide here, is so much better from a tax perspective than putting it into a private foundation.
Yeah. Yeah, you're looking at fair market value versus cost basis. That's always a really, really important consideration for those tax deductions. Anything else that, is sort of either the cautionary tale or, the things that clients can consider?
I think the other thing, the first bullet on this slide about the size. So typically private foundations, because of the complexity, and it really is establishing a standalone entity and filing the tax returns, I really think that the trend has been big dollar amounts in private foundations. Ever since donor advised funds became popular, like 30 years ago, where private foundations, there's fewer and fewer and more donor advised funds. And there's donor advised funds that have hundreds of millions of dollars in them. So while they're easy to start at a lower level, they work functionally for folks who have significant assets as well. The other thing that I've observed over the years is just because of the timing of when folks need to make gifts, particularly if they're selling a business or planning an estate or some of those things, sometimes just the act of establishing the private foundation quickly can be a barrier to that vehicle. And a donor advised fund can literally be propped up in an hour. And so sometimes the timing drives the vehicle as well, because the donor advised fund is just such a simple turnkey option, and yet it has so many bells and whistles for the many things that most donors might want to do with their philanthropic goal or to meet their philanthropic goals.
And that's
Don't tell my boss that it can be set up in an hour. That's way too fast.
Well,
yeah, but it doesn't take a whole lot of paperwork and not a whole lot of legal review. It's a pretty straightforward document.
Yeah.
This is also, and that can come in handy where because the IRS's step transaction doctrine comes into play here. And a lot of times if the gift transaction gets too close to the actual sale, there's not enough time, and the IRS is going to look at that more closely. So even being able to put weeks or a month, separate the two transactions can be really, really useful.
Mm-hmm. And that's a great point. As we look at sort of the when to use which question, that's what's next here. There's some deciding factors I really wanted to point out that, from a no extra variables kind of perspective, right? If a client wants control, a private foundation is probably going to satisfy that need. If they're looking to hire employees, if that's part of, they're wanting to really run that from their again, the control perspective, but having employees, including family members, and I'm going to have both of you chime in on some of the cautionary tales around that. A private foundation can hire employees and, you know, and put them on staff on salary. For grant making, either or honestly both are really great options for grant making. I will be a little biased. I think donor advised funds are so much more effective in grant making. And we see that simply from the perspective that donor advised funds are more actively contributing to charitable causes than private foundations do, simply from that 5% threshold versus what donor advised funds are paying out, which is usually around 25%. And from the perspective of asset management, again, deciding factors, I think it can be either, depending on the goals of the donor or the client. For contributions, as we pointed out, donor advised funds for assets that can be liquidated, it's much easier, and community foundations are really equipped to handle illiquid assets and to liquidate those proceeds. But a private foundation, again, can do those things as well, but they're really, if a donor's priority is to hold on to illiquid assets, then that would be potentially the better choice there. And then for privacy, as we've pointed out, if privacy is truly an important part of a client's need, and I will personally just point out, I think that trend is increasing. I don't know if Laura and Kelly, you're seeing that there's a level of a desire for more privacy. You know, I think in the world of where everything's online, it's kind of nice to have that extra layer between the donor and their giving, where they can truly be completely anonymous with a donor advised fund. So
that's a big trend.
That's a good deciding factor for a lot.
And that recently, that seems to have become the deciding factor in many, many cases. I've talked with people who are have hundreds and hundreds of millions of dollars, and could easily have a private foundation, of course. They have chosen a donor advised fund at a community foundation because of the privacy issues and because of the options that gives them. Because as Kelly pointed out, they can call it the Smith Family Foundation at the community foundation. To the external world, people don't know. And then they can choose when to make a grant in the name of the Smith Family Foundation or anonymously. So that option through a donor advised fund at the community foundation is really nice to have.
Mm-hmm. And private foundations also report, part of the reporting is the contributions, how much they're receiving in gifts. Donor advised funds, there's no contribution reported. So there's nothing public about a donor's gift into a donor advised fund either. Sorry, Kelly, you were chiming in?
Oh, no, I was just going to remark, I agree with what both of you said. And I think that the privacy is a big deal, and it's either managed through just having the donor advised fund, or in some cases, the private foundation paying its 5% into the donor advised fund and using that as a vehicle, both to facilitate the grant making, expeditiously and simply, but also to toggle in and out of anonymity. So they can either be standalone or working side by side.
Yeah, that's a great point. We do have, some that will satisfy that 5% payout by making a grant from the private foundation into a donor advised fund. And then the grant making happens from the donor advised fund from there. And like you said, it can be anonymous if they would like. One of the things I always say is with donor advised funds, you can set one up and kick the tires. And that's a really great place for clients to start who aren't quite sure what they might want to do for the long term. So you can, whoops, what is happening here? Sorry, I had my computer just popped up that it was going to do an update, and I do not want to do an update.
No, not now.
But you can have a client kick the tires and figure out sort of what their goals might be for the longer term with a donor advised fund. You can't kick the tires with a private foundation, right? You set one up and you're stuck with it unless you go through the legal process of shutting it down and converting it elsewhere. So it's a great way, it's low cost to kick that tire. It's low risk, and that really helps clients figure out what would be right for them for the future. And if they do decide that they prefer a private foundation for the long term, there are actually many options for community foundations some community foundations offer services that will administer the private foundation on their behalf. And there's also other third-party options like Foundation Source, et cetera, that will offer all the administrative services to a private foundation. Of course, it's all fee-based and such, and those fees can vary. But that can take some of the burden off of, that back of the house dealing with a private foundation. And sometimes, as we pointed out, the right solution for clients could be to have both. Laura, I did want to, you had mentioned before about, in a previous conversation about hiring family members. I did want to point this part out. Any cautionary tales around private foundations that hire family members?
Yeah, and this is one of those things. It's when you think about it, and Kelly, you said it so well. You're starting a business, and with a private foundation, when businesses sometimes have employees, the family members get into all kinds of interesting issues. And even this is just a little seed to plant, but Andrea, you all, I'm sure run into this occasionally, that some people want that they want that public charity status, and they still want to have their own programs that maybe involve paying people, not necessarily family members, but they can do supporting organizations. So there are a lot of hybrids here, and I think that's one of the really important takeaways, is that the community foundation is going to be able to really kick the tires on whatever the situation is and figure out, what's going to be the right fit. But Kelly, I know you and I have talked about this issue a lot.
Well, it's funny. This question made me remember research I'd read, and I was trying to find it this morning, but this was certainly my experience and practice. So I'll speak to this anecdotally, but there's also research about how many folks say they're going to employ family members as a part of the private foundation, but when it ultimately gets to it, they don't, because of the extra scrutiny that the IRS puts on that relationship. And so it's not to say it doesn't happen. There are certainly private foundations who employ family members, and that is fine. It's legal and everything. But I think a lot of families find that it just isn't worth the additional scrutiny that it places on the entity. So it's certainly a consideration for the family as they're thinking about setting this up, and getting good tax and legal counsel up front to truly understand what that dynamic is going to look like is really, really important.
Yeah, I had, and just from the cost perspective, even without hiring employees, I had experience with a previous private foundation that I had worked with, and they were spending out around $70,000 a year in administrative costs, and that was without an employee. And we're only making about $15,000 to $25,000 a year in grant making. And it really just started to not make sense anymore when they added up the legal fees, accounting fees, and all those things that they had just increasing levels of expenses around. So, and then if you were to add in a layer of hiring employees, certainly that's when you're talking about being truly a large private foundation that's going to be running programming and such. Typically, that's when you get into the employee questions. One of the things that came up for us just this year, over the spring and summer, we actually had 2 local private foundations that converted into funds here at the community foundation. One of them, the donor called me and said, quite literally, "I'm so sick of dealing with this." And, you know, it had been set up 30 some odd years ago. And she said, can you take it? Can you please just take this? You know, I want to convert it into this type of fund and do this, you know, XYZ with it. And she said, and I just want to kind of, you can send me the reports annually of what's going on, but otherwise, please run this for me. And so we went through the conversion process with her attorney and CPA and got it all set up. And that just, that closed this summer. So we've got that one now as a conversion. And then another one that the parents had passed on. This was established by them during their lifetime. And all the kids are scattered around. None of them really wanted to take this on. And so the attorney was handling this, the attorney and the CPA were handling this. And they, you know, knew about our work and they called us up and they said, we want to convert this into a fund at the community foundation. And so we completed that conversion as well. So, you know, sometimes it really just, even if they start somewhere with a private foundation, it might evolve over time. And those are options that you can share with your clients, that they can make conversions to a fund here and simplify their life a little bit, if that makes sense. But certainly, overall, there's a great opportunity for collaborative impact for private foundations and donor advised funds that work together. So certainly, I don't think it's, you know, one or the other necessarily. Your clients will help, you know, navigate that, and we can help with those conversations as well if you want to navigate through some of these questions that they might have about private foundations or donor advised funds, or working with both options together. I wanted to point out some resources we have available to all of our advisors and donors online. Giving.cfnorthstate.org is full of all sorts of bits of information, giving options, resources, even gift calculators. So you can do a lot of great handy things. There's some interactive tools on there. Check that out if it is useful for you or your clients. And we wanted to give a chance for questions as well. So here's my information if you'd like to reach out to me with any questions. But otherwise, you know, if you have questions for Kelly, Laura, or myself, open up the mics and we can have some more chats. Not hearing anyone chime in. But I do really appreciate Kelly, Laura, your great information.
Well, I was just
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I'm finding more and more of the private foundations are aging. Like Kelly had pointed out and Andrea had pointed out, is a lot of the ones who set these things up, the ones that with the passion for that original foundation, are aging. And not that I'm not speaking truth, but IRS really stinks lately about, you know, keeping up with paperwork, even through the COVID ridiculousness. No matter if you had proof of mailing and you did everything electronic, they are still saying, and even the DOJ, oh, you didn't send your stuff in, we're going to revoke you. And then the whole going through and, you know, reviving them is such a pain in the bucket. They don't make it an easy thing at all. And there's several of them that I'm working on that have come to me as new ones because of that situation. And that's what a lot of what I've been doing in the last 6 months is reviving these guys. And it's so painful. And so many of them are seeing it's ridiculous on the paperwork, you know, that it's just very hard. It's very time consuming. And some of these who started off with maybe 15 or 20 million, some of them have done really well. And they hold a lot of properties and things that can't be liquidated. So, you know, they're moving them over isn't necessarily a thing, but some of them are very liquid or have a lot of shares and stuff that have really appreciated and can totally be liquidated. But they're getting to the point where they don't want to manage it anymore. It's so overwhelming, and the paperwork and the timing and how tight the timing has to be to get things in. Your RRF1 doesn't match the timing on your tax returns. And I mean, it's just, they get lost. And again, like Kelly was saying, you know, when you have the youngins come up and take over, they're like, I got kids in soccer. I've got to go to basketball games. I've got to cook dinner. I've got to manage my own house and maybe my own rentals. And, you know, it's life. And so it's so much nicer when you can have these DAFs over to you guys, where you have a panel that can sit down and have blocked out time to focus on those and make good decisions versus, oh shoot, that CD is coming due, we got to do something, just roll it over, you know. And then that wasn't a good management decision, but they didn't make time for it. Yeah. So I totally love the DAF ideas on several of them, but I just wanted to kind of pipe in and say that I think regulatory issues lately have really caused a problem for a lot of our nonprofits, especially our private foundations. Like Kelly was saying, is not private at all. I mean, everything they do, we have to list everybody who donated something, how much they donated, if it's over 5,000, and what their address is, you know, all kinds of stuff that you lose a lot of your own privacy on the situation as a donor even. So, you know, I love these. I love the animal of the DAFs. That's all I wanted to say.
Thanks, Colleen.
Yeah, you're spot on, Colleen. And it is so interesting because I think, you know, 30 years ago, when a lot of 30, 40, 50 years ago, when a lot of these private foundations were established, we just didn't, you know, the industry didn't know as much about donor advised funds. They hadn't hit their peak popularity. And so some of the conversions that are happening now are these private foundations that were established at the time where that was the vehicle of choice. And as we hit this generational transition, there's different options. And it is truly an individual case of starting with the why are we doing this? What are we trying to accomplish? And then backing into the how, which tools or tool will get us there.
Yeah.
And you're right. It's not only the hassle, just the administrative hassle, but the risk. You know, it's both of those things that just tip the scales. Like, okay, not only is this a lot of work, but now it's suddenly become really risky and very public. Like, not worth it. Yeah.
Well, thank you all so much for joining us. If you have any other questions, feel free to reach out to me or anyone here at the Community Foundation. Really appreciate your time, Laura and Kelly. Thank you for joining us and your great insights on everything as always.
Thank you.
We will send out the resources, links, slide decks, and the recording for everyone to be able to check out for their future use. But appreciate you all joining us and hope you have an excellent day. Thanks so much.
Thank you for
everybody.
Have a nice weekend, everyone.
Bye.